minutes, but it's 4:01, so let's get started. This is Boroughs and Burbs, Season 2, Episode 5, and this is the pricing show. And we have two experts this week on pricing. We have a college rivalry. We have Jonathan Miller, the famous, dare I say, famous New York appraiser, who teaches at Columbia. What do you teach at Columbia?
Market analysis of all things.
Market analysis.
Yeah, and every summer. I don't do it, obviously not full time. Every semester, about 190 students or so.
And here's Dr. Doctors. Excellent. I'll let him. Where is he? Is he on my screen? Okay, well, he's joining the meeting now. My second guest is Dr. Rob Doctors. He is formerly of Bloomberg, formerly of Ernst & Young, currently a Yale professor of pricing. And I'm very excited to have both of you on the show because everybody on this show thinks they're an expert on pricing. We all think we know a thing or two about pricing. And when we talk to our buyers and our sellers, they're all expert on pricing. And it occurred to me that we're all winging it most of the time. We think that through a combination of doing a little bit of research, doing a little bit of talking to the other people in our offices, and intuition and experience, that we can price major assets. $20 million townhouses, $1 million apartments, whatever it is, we think we're expert. So I wanted to get two experts in to really find out how expert the rest of us are or aren't, because we can be prone to making some very big mistakes. So with that, Jonathan, what do you think of that?
Well, I think we have a prime example of a recent sort of misunderstanding of an ability to price, and that's with Zillow Offers, which Zillow Offers was just shut down because they accelerated what they took into inventory so quickly, and they overpaid, and they didn't recognize that the market was starting to level off. And they ramped up their pricing, and actually a lot of investors on the ground were gaming it to make that extra 3 to 5%. Just one quick thing, I don't want to go too much into this topic, but I just always marvel at how the world doesn't seem to really know how wildly inaccurate estimates are. And full disclaimer, I was on the Trulia industry advisory board before they had a website. And right at the tail end of my term is when they started thinking about doing their version of a Zestimate. So just real quickly, when you think of a Zestimate, and Zillow Offers said they didn't use a Zestimate, but I'm sure they use similar technologies to do it, and you know, whatever they used didn't work. But nationwide, they claim that their median accuracy rate is within 2% of what actual value is, right? Okay, so that's median, which means that 50% of the time it's within 2%, and 50% of the time it's not, right? And it gets better. When you look at, it's only 2%, and this is national, it's only 2% if the property's on the market for sale. If it's not on the market, they're only within 7% median accuracy rate, 6.8, something like that, 6.7. So in other words, the irony here is that to get from 7 to 2, they need a broker to price the property, which is sort of mind-blowing, because the whole idea of this is to sort of automate pricing. And in my industry too, I'm an appraiser by trade. the models don't know that there's 500 feral cats living in this colonial. So there's a lot of issues with it. Anyway, I just thought it was a good, since we're talking about pricing, there's a difference between price and value.
A follow-up on that. So if Zillow, which employs a lot of very smart people, is so wrong, if their median, you said their median is 2% off?
Nationally, yes, it varies by state, but it's within roughly plus or minus around 2.
And there's some of the smartest people in the business. Then what is an acceptable level of error? What is an acceptable level of error?
So a long time ago, when the relocation industry, before housing was really rising consistently, pricing was rising consistently over the last decade or more. My appraisal firm did a lot of relocation work. And so you were rated on how close you got to what the property actually sold for in your appraisal. And we didn't do market value, we did anticipated sale price. So we were looking into the future 3-4 months, depending on each client that was, say, moving a block of employees, would have certain specifications of how far in the future we would look. And we were rated, and if we were within with one of the relocation companies, we were the #1 in New York, and we were within 3%. And we were way ahead of several other firms. And this was sort of this is actually pre-financial crisis. This was pre-Street Easy. This was pre, the tremendous influx of sort of transparency that we have now. And there is a big difference between value and price. Value is what the market supports, and price is a number. And the problem, just because somebody's smart, I'm really smart, but I'm not a good plumber. I think is the way to think of it. Valuation is this combination of sort of specific data sort of digestion combined with sort of subjective through experience. At least that's how I've always viewed it, and in my practice. More data doesn't necessarily make it more accurate, I guess, is another way to look at it.
But if your subset's very, very small, it's very potentially volatile as far as what your result.
The smaller the subset, the more the volatility, for sure. So if you're looking at you're trying to price something in a unique subset of the market, and in a good year, there's 8 sales, right? That's actually one of the reasons when you go higher in price strata, the precision of pricing falls off because it's less homogeneous. Like one of the reasons, I was talking about Zillow offers, one of the reasons iBuyers, or that category, is wholly dependent on is homogeneous housing stock.
Sure.
So it doesn't work in markets where the housing is very eclectic. It doesn't work in vertical housing markets like a city where 3A is the same as 33A. It doesn't work yet. I mean, I'm sure it will at some point in the future, or more than it does now. But it's cities like Phoenix and Las Vegas where there's 5,000 homes within 20 square miles that have 1 of 5 floor plans. And even with that type of housing stock, they couldn't get it right in a rising market. The precision that, like Open Door, which is sort of the sort of brand of iBuying, and funded by SoftBank, their margins are extremely thin in a rising market in a homogeneous housing stock. So pricing isn't just about raw numbers and having more data. I think there's a little bit more to it than that.
Rob, doctors. You're teaching the students that first of all, let me point out to everybody that you have made a career out of becoming an expert on pricing. Bloomberg's, Ernst & Young, you have been focused on pricing for a very long time, and now you're teaching it to students at Yale, seniors at Yale. Can you tell us, what are you teaching these Yale students about pricing?
Well, I appreciate what Jonathan said, but I actually kind of disagree with him on quite a few things he said. And you know,
He's from Columbia.
Sorry?
Because he's at Columbia, and that might have something to do with it.
I'm a Columbia MBA. I think nothing more highly than Columbia. In any case, first of all, just really broad, I claim pricing, one of its biggest uses, has nothing to do with setting the price. It has to do with driving the price. So for instance, one of the things, you know, and I've priced properties in a number of markets. And in fact, we'll just take the example that you're a little familiar with, John. We priced a house on an island, a desert island in the middle of nowhere. And it was very clear that the realtors did not understand how important a deep water dock was for that property. And having the deep water dock was worth over $100,000 to the property price. But they all looked at it on the basis of cost. Oh, it cost $50,000 to put a dock. Yeah, that's what it's worth for this house. Wrong. Apropos Jonathan's comment, the value to someone who wants to go fishing every day, having a deep water dock, was far greater than its cost. And that applies to any number of markets. For instance, I've done the math on some houses in New Canaan. Very clearly, the market, at least at the time I did it, and it changes over time, again, apropos to Jonathan's point, was very much in favor of colonials. So for instance, one house that I did this for, they had a bunch of shutters on all the windows and they wanted to get rid of them. They're all rotten. But I said, no, your house in part is being driven by its colonial appearance. Don't get rid of the shutters. I personally hate shutters, by the way, but they definitely had to keep them for selling. So once you know what the drivers are, you can do two things. You can modify the product, keep the shutters, for instance, or you could change the message. I agree also with Jonathan. It's not going to be just happy agreement for a while. Don't worry, I'll say something.
No, I'm bracing myself.
Very good. Well, that's okay. You're from Columbia. I have to be nice to you. One of the things I agree with you is that the higher end the market, the tougher it is because the samples are small. We're about to disagree on samples, by the way, in a second. But I was also the senior pricer at McKinsey & Company. And we got an interesting request, just fascinating request. There's a company out there that will build you an oasis. So if you're an oil sheik and you have too many billions to do with, and you're sitting there in your tent or whatever, palace, and you say, you know, what I'd like is a oasis. And so for about $6 million initially and several $1 million to keep it up afterwards, they'll build you an oasis. Very bad sample size. Just ain't too many people on the oasis market. So yeah, I agree with you. But I will say, particularly when I work with younger people, they all overestimate the value of sample size. Sample size, just let's see what the actual statistical law says. You can't have a sample size under 3 because the confidence level is function that has underneath the denominator n-2, which means it goes to 0 if you only have 2 samples. You need 3, but it's better to have more. But the truth is, your sample value goes down very rapidly. It goes to 0 by the time you have a 200 sample case. But I find you can do quite a lot with 15 or 20 sample points. And one of the reasons I like that is because I can look at all 15 points and say, really, there were 200 feral cats in that basement or whatever. You can't do that with, I've had associates of McKinsey come to me with thousands of points and they meant nothing. And so, sample size doesn't bother me much. Now, the problem is, I think most of the models are pretty crummy. Most people do not know how to run samples or how to run models. They do a few regressions, do a little dance, and that's the model, and it sucks. Frighteningly enough, I've done this for a large pharmaceutical company, and I saw what they were doing, and they are not actually running decent statistical samples. But nobody at the FDA is any brighter, so these stupid samples end up on our shelves. So just to scare you a little bit. But look, so what do you need to do? You need to know what drives the price. Driving the price, for instance, might be a who question. For instance, did a piece that was software for CPAs. It turned out which CPA firm the junior CPA had trained with determined how much they were willing to pay for that software, how much they were willing to, which one they wanted. So you got to know the details behind it. In real estate, you got to know where is that buyer coming from? Where are the trends of buyers coming from? Mostly, people look at the facts at hand, not the questions they should be asking, like where are the buyers coming from? They're asking, oh, how many square feet is this house? How many yards? How large is the yard? And those are drivers. They're just not the only drivers. And as you do only those drivers, you're not going to get as good a confidence limit. Have to know what's driving the market.
So if I was to give you a case study on this, there's a condo complex here in New Canaan, and I just was asked to go price a 3-bedroom condo for sale. And I said, I think it's worth $1 million. And the owner said, that's funny because the very experienced agent who just left said it's worth 750. And I said, why? And they said, well, she said that kitchen and all the bathrooms need to be redone, and therefore it's not worth as much as all the other recent $950,000 sales. So what I hear you saying is that she was looking at the cost to put in a new kitchen and she was discounting off of past sales. I was looking at how many other 3-bedroom condos are for sale right now in New Canaan, and what are they asking? And so I said, if the average one is asking $1,050,000 and I can discount a little bit off of that in a rising market, I can get to $1 million. So which one of us is right? The one who says, okay, I'm going to take a conservative approach, and I'm going to take the last sale. I mean, that's what Zillow does. They take sales that have already been recorded, right? And then they key off of that. Whereas I said, I'm not going to key off of the sales that have already been recorded. I'm going to look across the horizon and see who I'm competing with today, not last month and not 3 months ago. Which one of these is the better approach? And where do we get ourselves in trouble? Either of you.
I believe in supply and demand, just to throw that in. Sorry, John, I didn't mean to.
No, I was just going to say, what I teach is market analysis, and virtually everything Robert's saying, I totally agree with. It's very logical. You're talking, his examples are, these unique properties where there's not a lot of data, and they're key drivers of value. In the case of your market, the first thing you want to be aware of is the market that this property sits within. What competing properties are out there, how much contract activity there is right now. Maybe there was a lot a couple of months ago, but things have cooled off because of the time of the year or whatever. It's not just the physical attributes of the property. I find, like, for example, there's so many attempts to sort of widgetize, like in the case of big tech, or have these standard formulas, like, hey, if it's a renovated bathroom, add 50,000 or whatever. What I find is there are periods of the market where, a renovated bathroom adds, a fraction of what it would cost to renovate the bathroom to the actual value, what it ultimately sells for. And other times where you might end up, seeing double the value, the contributory value of a renovated bathroom. Like that, the way to think of amenities is that their contributory value, sort of, appraisers speak for how much they add to the total picture, varies all the time. Like that, like there's no like set, sort of rule book on, it's really case by case. So in the case, I would be more inclined, mainly because you invited me to the podcast, to go with your approach, just to be a team player. But I would look at it as, what's fresh, what's happening right now, but also be cognizant of,
You're in
hey,
a
Labor Day is, or whatever holiday, or, there's a slowdown. Historically, I've seen it for 20 years. A little bit more of a macro perspective on top of, just the attributes of the property.
I find it very refreshing that as an appraiser who is obligated to go look at all of the most recent relevant past sales, that you're giving me permission to kind of put that aside and actually look out
Well,
at
I think people confuse sort of, and there's a lot of appraisers out there that sort of rest on, hey, I've got to provide 3 closed sales, which is silly. You triangulate value, you have to, it's like you look at close, look at contract, look at listings, and the amenities that each of them have, and, what was inside them, and, interview the people that sold it, get a sense of, there were 5 backup offers, last week, there were 5 backup offers on this property. And it ended up ultimately going to the second person in line because the first deal fell through. Like, the way I think of valuation is, I think of it as, and this is sort of, super general, but it's kind of like you go to Starbucks with your best friend and tell them why you think the house they just put under contract, why you think it's worth it. Like there's a lot of intangibles, as Robert was bringing up, or not intangibles, but things that aren't necessarily cookie cutter answers. And that's what makes somebody that's sort of embedded in the local market, have an advantage, perhaps, in some cases.
Can I ask you something, John? One of the things that, like, from a real practical standpoint, is there, for example, we were talking earlier about the vertical sense of just the way New York is. It's very vertical. So apartment 6A is where, assuming all things fairly equal, apartment 6A equals $1 million per floor. Is there a formula by which per floor there's a certain value increase, or it's in what the value increase would be, that it's on the front of the building facing the park and it's on the back of the building not facing the park, or,
Right.
There's certain definite factors that are like a quantitative formula that allow you to get to a certain valuation.
So the answer to that would be sort of. There, like, we don't have an, sort of a notebook with, canned adjustments. But I can tell you, for example, I co-wrote a white paper, my only foray into published academia, with NYU Furman. We did a study of about 100,000 transactions that I had collected on the Manhattan apartment market, and we could see during this study, which was about a decade ago, and subsequent to it, a lot of times adjustments should be thought of in a proportional way as a starting place, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it still holds. And so, for example, in towers, with the one big thing is separating floor level and view, because they're different amenities, and that often confuses the mix. So we found, somewhere in the neighborhood of 1% of floor, assuming no change in view. And then there's like additional, when you clear, the rooftop. New York Magazine did a story with me where I literally priced an entire condo based on sales of 2 units, using what I had learned and sort of proportionally thinking about adjustments. And as it turned out, over the next couple of years, we were spot on. The market was stable, so it wasn't like this sort of crazy volatility that we have now. So there are, I just am contradicting myself, because I said earlier, hey, there's no rules of thumb. But you do have sort of like comfort levels of where to start and then sort of prove it wrong. And one of them is floor level for sure.
All right, so let me ask you, you're an appraiser. I just kind of want to understand your mandate, because I'm going to give you a scenario that I'm sure like a lot of people on this call have experienced. Your mandate is to find the value of a property, not about pricing. And is it the value of now, or is it also the value of potentially later? Because I had a situation, there's two scenarios here. I had a situation where someone was buying apartment A and apartment B, they were going to combine them. And the bank asked for 2 appraisals for what the combined value would be when finished. And the disparity in the values was incredible. I mean, I think one was at 3.8 and one was at 2.4. I mean, that is a big gap. And then also the other one I just want to ask you about is, this happens all the time. We go to a presentation with a prospective seller and we say, the value, we essentially feel that the value is, whatever we talk about, it's about $2 million. I just got my apartment refinanced last year and we did an appraisal and they appraised it for 2.5. And pulling them back from that, which is an unrealistic scenario of there's no way that this apartment would sell for 2.5. Like, I just want to talk, I want you to comment on those scenarios.
Sure. So the first thing is, since Dodd-Frank, post-financial crisis, and I would, even before Dodd-Frank, in May 1st of 2009, there was an act. It was called the Home Valuation Code of Conduct. I won't go into too much of it, but the acronym is pronounced HAVOC to people in the appraisal industry. And essentially what it did is it actually, and this could be a 5-hour discussion, which I don't want to go there. But essentially what has happened since the financial crisis is that the banking industry and the sort of broader appraisal industry have been massively incentivized for speed and cost, and barely any consideration for quality of valuation. And firms like mine, which, I'm biased obviously for my firm, but I think that there are standout firms in some markets that really get value, and then others that are sort of robots, or sort of, it's sort of like, we call them form fillers. And so the dynamics of the sort of the appraisal economy is, the quality of valuation today is the worst it's ever been in my 37 years in the business. And I won't work for lenders, like traditional retail banks, because, and again, this is a long sort of thing, but I would have to take a 70% pay cut because I have to share it with an institutional middleman, which is freaking bizarre. And so they're not going to attract good people. So the problem is, the way to sort of think about valuation is that you have to be on the defensive when you meet a bank appraiser, and you have to assume they know nothing. And I hate to say it that way, but that is a reality, because you'll have 12 appraisers, an appraiser from Albany win a bid from a bank to get the appraisals, and they'll come down in 24 hours, crank out 12 appraisals. Like, who wants that? Like, that's crap. So there's this, and again, sort of what I was alluding to, it's an external factor in terms of valuing the profession. The profession is significantly challenged, sort of, with Dodd-Frank, because Havoc or HVCC was sort of sunset into Dodd-Frank.
PhD.
And I bring this up because this is a reality that agents see all the time. So I think the better way to sort of resolve this problem is what information do you bring to this person, and how do you interact with them on site? Like, that's how you almost have to sort of help them see what's going on in the market, which sort of defeats the whole purpose, because you're paid on commission, and the appraiser doesn't care whether the deal closes or not. They get their appraisal fee. I'm not saying all appraisers are bad, just like not all brokers are bad, any industry, but the problem is that since the financial crisis, it is not normalized. I don't think I answered one of your other questions. Just one quick thing, just to answer your question, is that our mandate is to provide a value opinion as of a moment in time, and that moment in time, for the sake of mortgage lending, is the inspection date, when we actually see the property. And the reason for that is if we do it, the couple days after, a week after, well, what if someone drove a bulldozer through the side of the house? Yes, I have seen that happen before, where there's a hole in the side of the house and the building was subsequently condemned. So you have problems when the inspection date and the effective date are not the same. And so that's why they tend to be the same.
But if I could just bring in, I think the word is completeness. That's a fairly important word. The trouble with a lot of appraisals, and I'm not talking to real estate, all sorts of things, is they're incomplete. They're not looking at the important factor, be it the truck that just fell into the building or whatever. There's a joke, and I hope it's slightly amusing, but the joke is guys walking down a street. At the end of the street, there's a street light, and there's somebody circling the street light. So this helpful person walks over and says, can I help you? And he says, yeah, I lost my car keys. And he says, oh. So they both look, and there's no car keys. And he says, I don't see any car keys. Is this where you lost it? He says, no, I lost it down the other side of the street, but there's no street light, so I can't look for it there.
Right, exactly.
That is your typical pricer. Just
yeah.
Why? So
right.
At any rate, just to say it, you get explosions of accuracy and the ability to ask for the right price if you know what's driving it. Example, I did some work for the Food Network a few years ago. We ended up saying they should increase their fees to the cable companies by 5-fold. Well, after the board picked itself up because they'd fallen off the chairs and stuff, we explained why, and they did it, and they got it. Now, you as a consumer, the only thing you noticed was Food Network went dark on Cablevision because they refused to do it. But after Cablevision was talked to, they got their 5-fold increase. You as a consumer might have to have paid a fraction of a penny for that because there's hundreds of networks. But just to say it, you don't know what the driver is, you don't know what to ask for.
Right. I was just going to say, because Robert told a joke, I have to tell a valuation joke too, just so that there's parity here. And this is something I find very useful or informative. The A in the word Zillow stands for accuracy.
All right, so I actually want to talk about that. we've spent a lot of time talking about trying to get pricing right. And we've talked about Zillow trying to get pricing right with his estimate and getting within 2%. And you talked about a goal at the beginning of the show for appraisers that you had a goal of getting it right within 3%. I want to bring your attention to David Ogilvy, who's rather a legend in real estate in Greenwich. And when he was given a property like the Helmsley estate in Greenwich, he put it out there at $100 million. And everybody looked at that and said, that can't be right. And sure enough, shortly the price came down, asking price came down to, it is several years ago, many years ago, maybe $50 million, and it sold for $30 million. Can you guys talk to me about using pricing as a strategy for, talk to me about David Ogilvy's strategy for pricing, where he obviously wasn't trying to get as close to the right price to begin with, but actually used price to enhance the price. So talk to me about that, either of you. What do you call that?
Pricing is a language.
Do they teach that at Yale? I mean, you know, I don't even know what to call that.
Pricing is a language. It is a signal. I mean, we all have heard that famous story about Grey Poupon. They put their mustard on the market for fairly mediocre price, and they actually had to withdraw from the market for a while before they could return with the right price. And there's lots of examples, like for instance, Volkswagen put out a car they sold for $100,000. It's about 15 years ago. And the only reason they did it was to prove to the world a Volkswagen does not need to be cheap.
Mhm.
Price is a language. Don't forget that.
I love that. On this, so back in 2014, I started to notice, and I think the phrase for that pricing is a phrase that I coined 5 or 6 years ago called aspirational pricing. You know, this sort of idea that, you know, there's like, you know, one of the things I do just as a hobby, because I'm a dull and boring numbers guy, is I collect all closed residential sales in the US that were 50 million or higher. And I started doing this because there was a sale of a condo in Manhattan for $88 million. Sandy Wild, Citigroup, sold this condo that he bought for $44 million, and he set the price. I think that's kind of how he managed Citigroup too. And he doubled the price, and then a Russian oligarch who was going through a divorce paid the 88 million and then nested it within like 5 LLCs, because he was doing that all over the US to try to hide the properties from his soon-to-be ex-wife, because it was part of a divorce. So the actual 88 million sent this signal out there that, hey, this very high end of the market, we have these, you know, this really big step up in value. But if you actually looked at it, it was this weird, you know, sort of personal interaction. And so what we saw is every week, like in the Wall Street Journal mansion section, there was a listing. This is the most expensive house listed in California, and this is the most expensive condo listed in Manhattan, and went on and on and on, and to the point where like the Hamptons, New York, was one of the worst offenders as a market, because, you know, when you have everybody, you know, you buy something for, just to be a sort of cavalier about the numbers, you buy something for $10 million, you put 5 into it, and you put it on the market for 40, right? And then everybody's doing the same thing. They're taking that $10 million, $10-15 million price property, and they're putting it on for 40, and they feel safe because everybody around them is around the same price. And, you know, they get like a bold-faced name mention in the New York Post, page 6, that says, hey, they currently have their estate on for 40 million in the Hamptons. But none of them ever sold at that number. You know, which we had that in LA, where you know, there were a couple of sales on the market for couple hundred million. There's one, that has been widely talked about. It's on for 500 million. Now it's on for 265. There's this like sort of era of aspirational pricing, and I think half of it was just to have bragging rights. It had nothing to do with ultimately selling the property. They did, who'd complain about those kind of numbers. And that's a case, I think, kind of what Robert was saying, that you're communicating this big number for a reason that has nothing to do with actually selling the home. It's sort of a weird dynamic.
So
Can we talk about the strategy of that though? For example, there was a property, I just spoke to a colleague, he went with a ton of our own colleagues. He went with a team of Brown Harris Stevens brokers. They priced something at around 12.5 million, and that was the correct price. They lost it to a different brokerage firm who told them 15.
Yeah.
They got the property. One buyer got a Rockstar, came in, bought it for 15, and it flew off the market. So they lost it.
Yep.
So the question is, yes, there's always, you could aspirationally price something to say, let's just try it, just to see, because there's always might be one person who's just, that's the right thing at the right moment, and they just want it, or they lost a couple of things. They're like, I just don't want to lose it, and they just buy it. But if that person is not out there at the moment, and that bench of those buyers is one deep or no deep, you do have to reduce the price. After how long, strategically, from a pricing standpoint, would it make sense, or does it even make sense to try it? Is it a bad strategy to try it?
I think of, when you were saying that story, I was thinking of the clock tower. I think it was a clock tower penthouse in Brooklyn, and it sold for 15 million, and it was like the highest sale in Brooklyn for a condo, something along that line, a few years ago. It was put on the market for 25 or 30 million, and it took 7 years, but it did sell for a record, right?
7 years.
Yeah, 7 years. And that was my comment. I said, well, it only took 7 years, but maybe the developer didn't care. I have no idea. The problem is, so there's always exceptions, or not exceptions, but there's always examples, like a buyer that was sick of losing, and money didn't really mean all that much to them, and they were just going to buy. Like, I get it, right? The problem, and I think, the type of housing can make a difference. Like, I think that becomes more, and maybe you're going to tell me I'm wrong, but like in a co-op, you have, I think that becomes a little bit more problematic than a condo necessarily, because it's entirely, like in a condo, I could see that happening, the higher probability of that happening than a co-op, in a high-end co-op, simply because condo, you have international, you have, people, a large swath of people that don't want to go through a board, approval process and all that. So it's not like, there's not like a straightforward strategy. The other thing is, I've found in my own experience often, and I don't know whether Robert has seen this, but I find that when a listing is overpriced, but not for some ulterior reason, just that it's just wrong. It's worth 5 million and it's put on for 6.9 or 7 million, and they won't reduce the price. And we find this in co-ops especially. You start seeing, and then it sells for, let's say it sells for 5, right? It's worth 5, sells for 5, but it was listed for 6.9. We've seen board turndowns in co-ops where they try to control the value in the building and say, hey, that's too low. We agreed with the 6.9, and they kill that. And then another buyer comes in, and it ends up going for 5.2 or 4.8, something, around the 5. So you clearly have market evidence that, hey, the value in this market is around 5. And then they kill that sale, and then the seller gives up. It never sells, because the pricing in the building, the brokers see that building as, hey, that board is completely out of their mind. They're not realistic. And they won't let the market be the market, I guess, or they think they're smarter than the market. I just consulted with somebody on this in a modest co-op in Queens, where it was on the market for 6 months. It sold, but they had an appraisal that came in. It was their guy, came in at a much higher number, and it was like 50,000 above the asking price that had been sitting for 6 months. I don't know what my point is, other than that you can damage value in certain circumstances by not pricing within the realm. And I think in a lot of stuff that Robert's talking about, like, he saw something that participants didn't see. So, he did a great service to his clients, which I think is different than, where you do have, it's cookie cutter, it's not unique, it doesn't have a deep water dock, and it's like, it's wildly overpriced. Anyway, that's my stream of consciousness.
There are certain scenarios also that are skewing the reality, is that I'm seeing, especially apartments that need work. Let's just take that example, a $7 million apartment, it's worth 5. Someone would end up offering 5.5, so that the contract goes to the board at 5.5, but they ask for a $500,000 construction credit at closing. So you have a closing at 5.5 on a value that's really 5.
Right.
Part of this all happens to be the story of, again, why pricing is intrinsically tied to language. So in other words, if they say a $500,000 set off, heck, detail it. Show me item by item where the 500,000 came from. And that is a persuasive argument, not just throwing out a number. I mean, just to say it, for instance, I did some work for a company that a lot of what they do could result in disastrously bad effects for the buyer. And all they had was a bunch of experienced salespeople who come in and say, oh, we've been doing this for 125 years. Thump, thump, thump on the chest. We know what we're doing. Look at this, and great people, blah, blah, blah. What we told them to do, and what we actually built for them, was a model that said, here is exactly why our process is better than the others. On step 3 of their process, you have the following failure points. On step 3 of our process, we do it right. That was an argument a buyer could accept. The buyer could take it to whoever was approving, or if they approved it themselves, they could feel good about it. So part of this is failure to communicate.
Right. Great point.
I want to talk about Zillow because it's capturing the news. I
feel like you didn't think my Zillow joke was funny, but
no,
I liked it.
But everybody is talking about the iBuying because it's capturing everybody's imagination. But long before there was iBuying, there was the Zestimate. I want to talk about the Zestimate. In the old days, before Zestimates, realtors would get together and, as you said, or appraisers would get together and evaluate all the criteria, having been in the house, been on the real estate. When the Zestimate came along, which was algorithmically developed based on the last appraisal, which could have been 2, 3, 5 years old.
No, it's not based on last appraisal. It's
not
based on now.
Okay.
It's based on, like, appraisals that we do, or appraisals that are done in general, aren't public record. Theirs is based on transactions in public record. That's it. That's the way to look at it.
So when they value something on Beach Road, they're looking at everything else on Beach Road and everything else but
that's why there's a 5% spread between their accuracy rate for something that is on the market versus that house is not on the market at that time, because they overweight the list price to get them. You know, it's sort of a cop out, but that's what and we've noticed that just in the last couple of years. That's not how it used to be. And to your other point about, they're at the mercy of public record, and then, you know, in the beginning, and then, you know, they've accumulated all this sort of proprietary data. And it's really interesting because you look at a public record like New York City, the dirtiest public record in the country, even though, you know, their sort of ability to share it and the access to it is pretty good, but the data quality, at least in Inaccuracy, is super, it's just filthy. And so it makes it much harder to price. Whereas California, boy, you know, the MLS systems out there are pristine, and they seem to have a better luck with that. I don't know what my point was. I just interrupted you.
So I'm talking about the Zestimate. I mean, there was a time before there was estimates. Now, all of my buyers, all of my sellers look at the Zestimate. All of my competing agents look at the Zestimate. It's hanging out there, and it's clear that
it's adversarial to the brokerage community generally.
yes.
And that's even made worse because when they went into iBuying, Zillow became a broker. So they literally became a competitor to the brokerage industry, which is kind of interesting.
So I'm going to share the screen for a moment here, and I just want to show all of you. This is, according to Zillow, how accurate their Zestimates are across the country. And I'll just point out Seattle. They are within 5% accurate 61.5% of the time. They're only within 5%, 61% of the time. That's pretty bad. In New York,
Right.
78.6% of the time. 3 out of 4 times they can get within 5%. That's not very accurate for something that has such a big influence on our lives.
Well, here's the thing, and I had, you know, more than a decade ago, you know, my sort of favorite story is the day before Zillow launched. I was at a industry event, and someone introduced me to Rich Barton, the current CEO, and you know, he said, "What do you do?" And I told him, I said, "What do you do?" And he said, "Well, you've ever heard of Expedia?" It's like, yeah, I created that. Now my next thing we're launching tomorrow morning is Zillow, as in rhymes with pillow. And I, you know, and that's all they were in business for. There were no listings on Zillow. They said they weren't going to be brokers, all that stuff. But the point was that they sort of changed the way we look at value. Hey, you could value your grandmother's house, you know, online, all that stuff, right? So it became a spectator sport, and it sort of made a life very hard for the brokerage community, because if the value on Zillow was higher than the broker estimate, then the broker was wrong. If it was lower, then the broker was right, right? I mean, that was the logic, because as we all know, if it's on the internet, it must be true. And I had Zillow came to my office. They were trying to get, because I had the largest collection at the time of co-op data, because it wasn't public record until 06, and I have data going way back and all that stuff. And I went through some scenarios with the co-founder about you know, my father-in-law in Detroit. Every house in the suburb is exactly the same, and there's a house around the corner from his that sold for 140, and there's other houses in the 135 to 155 range, and his estimate said his house was worth 75. And he said the consumer will know if the Zestimate is not correct. And I said, no, they won't. I said, you know, if they say it's 170 in a 140 market, you know, they're not saying it's $1 million. The consumer's going to go with that. And actually, in some ways, lengthens the time on the market, which ends up potentially damaging the value, as we were talking about damage earlier, because you have an unreasonable seller and the brokerage community, sees that, or, that word is passed around, and that becomes part of the sort of calculus beyond just the physical attributes of a home. It's kind of interesting.
It's the
It would be,
context.
go ahead.
I was just going to say it's the context. And, it is not, context could include the history because people remember old prices. That could include who the current competitive set is. It could include whether there's a pandemic that's pulling people out of New York City. It could include a ton of stuff. Apropos of the earlier discussion we had about, lowering or raising prices, there's something I call a naked price rise or a naked price decrease. Never be naked. You have to give them some excuse for what you're doing. So, for instance, if you really have to decrease the price by something, say something like, oh, well, we just noticed a family of chipmunks in the front yard. It doesn't have to be very serious. Because apropos of Jonathan's comment, the buyers don't know much. One of my favorite examples of pricing people believed it was impossible was the Coca-Cola company, an old client of mine. If you walked into a Walmart for a while, you could buy a 6-pack of Coke for about $4 something in the beverage aisle. If you walked over to the sporting goods aisle, Coke was running a program called Recycle to Wear. They'd collect old cola bottles and turn them into sweatshirts. And Russell, I think it was, the manufacturer that did it. You'd pay $2 more, almost 30% more for a thing of Coke in a Walmart. Contemplate that environment. Walmart, known for its low everyday prices. Coca-Cola, the one thing that does not vary in the world, is Coca-Cola. Right. So the exact same thing had 2 prices within 40 yards of each other. So you got to understand, people don't in fact know the price. You need to have a story that covers it somehow.
Is there a seasonality to pricing that we should be aware of? Meaning, if I'm a buyer and I'm looking for real estate and I'm told, oh, I can get my best deals in November and December, then what's causing that, and can I capitalize on it, or is that going away in a 24/7 market? Seasonality. Anyone want to talk about seasonality and what's happening to it lately?
Well, I can tell you that in 2020, for the most part, there was no seasonality from mid-March and to some point, in the fall, because it was this external force, release of pent-up demand, drop in mortgage rates after already dropping for the preceding couple of years, despite a pretty, decent economy. And so we're seeing, you can see it now in listing inventory trends in the 3 dozen or so housing markets I'm tracking around the US. It's back. You're seeing sort of this normalized ebb and flow. I mean, no matter how weak or strong the market, with the exception of a global pandemic, you always have, like, for example, Fairfield County, like, you see the trend. It's a contract activity is a 2-hump camel, spring and fall, right? I mean, the intensity of the humps vary with the intensity of the market, but even in a dead market, a very quiet market, there was. And we're starting, in 2021, we're seeing some return to that. And I think that's partly how you should think about pricing when you're coming on a market. Are the conditions, maybe some properties it doesn't make any difference, or the needs of the seller doesn't make any difference when they sell. But I do look at, if the market is at high intensity, that is different than a market that it's sort of, not stalling, but sort of sleeping. It's the week after Christmas. Doesn't mean the week after Christmas is always a bad market for all properties, but in aggregate, it probably is. So the time of year does make a difference. In fact, I did this a few years ago where I looked at contract dates in Long Island for a whole year and looked at what day of the week and what day was the day of most contract signings. And I did it for over a couple of years, and it was always within a couple of days of each other, sometime in May. I believe it was May. I don't remember the date though, but there was like a seasonal aspect to it, which I thought was kind of interesting.
Is there any way for you to quantify the emotional quotient of an apartment? For example, it's someone comes in and it feels absolutely amazing, which differentiates it from the exact same apartment right next door. 2 apartments identical. And I mean, that just becomes, you can't quantify that. So when we're talking about maybe value, an empty value to something might be the same.
Stagers.
The emotional quotient of pricing it is very fundamental.
Stagers try and quantify it all the time. They say, hire me to stage it, hire me to tap into that emotional quotient. Your house will be worth, your apartment will be worth, and they say, as much as 10% more. I mean, is that true?
I promise you, Coca-Cola does exactly that. The emotional thing of having a Coke on a beach versus Coke at a football game versus Coke somewhere else. And I claim you should be able to do that with real estate because, like I say, if it's somebody fleeing the pandemic in New York, high emotional interest. If it's somebody squarely in the middle of summer, not having kids transfer school or whatever, low emotional interest. And, we've sometimes gotten to break out things. For instance, Hallmark cards. And Hallmark actually knows very clearly how much they're getting from different emotional stimuli. Not that they poll the person that says, so did you really care about your grandmother who just died? They don't do that, but they kind of know from some other patterns, proxies, what drove that card sale. And I claim in real estate, where you're staring the person in the eye, a luxury Hallmark, Coca-Cola and others do not have, you should be able to do better. Example of a nice mechanized form, Expedia, who I did not work for, but I worked for another company in that industry. When I say work for, I mean consulted. If you go to their website and you look up a flight, try this as an experiment. Get their price, drop off for more than 5 minutes, come back, and that price will be up to 5% higher. Yeah, Roberto's known this. So, yeah.
Absolutely. My wife, when we go to look for a trip, she's like, don't look up the flights yet.
Or at least clear your browser, if nothing else. Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
Fascinating.
So you're saying that I need to up my emotional game, that I'm leaving some money on the table if I'm not tapping into all that. At my open house, when I got them coming in, I need to bake those cookies. I need those fresh flowers on the table, whatever it is to add to the emotion of the experience. Okay. I got to up my game.
Your videos are good and they do tap into that.
I know, and then they get there and they see the real me, and it's not quite like the video. I met a guy yesterday and he said, I called you in because of the videos. And I said, what video? And he said, I like the one of you fly fishing in the stream, behind the condominium. And I thought, okay, I guess he recognizes that we realtors sometimes are storytellers. And if we can tell an emotional story, it does have an impact. This has been phenomenal, guys. I want to give you both a chance to kind of sum up what have we learned about pricing. Either of you ready? I mean, this has been great because we've tackled Zillow, Zestimates, emotional. We've talked about pricing language. We've talked about aspirational pricing. Jonathan Miller coined that phrase. So what is my takeaway? What's my big takeaway?
I think the way I think of pricing or value is that I think of it as a perishable product. It's the people that are generating a value, a broker for a listing, an appraiser for an appraisal. It's a moment in time, and that rules of thumb that you have developed over your career are not something to live and die by. It isn't something necessarily to ignore, but I would be very worried about that. Also, I think when we think of valuation, I think, Robert really made this point clear, you really have to think outside of the physical characteristics of the property, and what is driving the transaction. That's one of the things, when I teach my class, it's, what is driving, why are people going to buy in this condominium? Right. I mean, what is going to drive them? And, getting beyond like, well, a new plant's going to open, new Tesla, factory is going to open or whatever. But, think of, it's okay to be subjective. It's like, hey, data, big data, objective, specific numbers. I just think that, and I think as we learned from Zillow, the Zillow offers sort of implosion is that they get you to a certain point, but they don't get you all the way there. And that's the problem, or that's the challenge.
My thought would be, that get off the naked pricing numbers. There's more to it than that. I have a book out called Contextual Pricing, and that is all about, hey, people never look at the complete set of facts. Now, the truth is, we don't all have time to do that. But if it's important to you, and most people find that selling their house, they care about the price they get, look more completely and expect some obstacles. As I think Jonathan observed, there are people out there, all they want to do is minimize the time they spend on selling your house. Well, to hell with them. You have to force them. You have to push them. So with that belligerent note, that's my add-on.
All right, I like it. Thank you both, gentlemen. This has been great. I will tell you that this has been our biggest audience yet for the season. And so I think it's a testimony that this is a very important subject to a whole lot of people, and not just realtors. So thank you very much for adding your expertise and your wisdom to a really tough subject. Roberto?
Thank you so much, guys. I really appreciate it. I was really looking forward to this. We could talk a little more, just saying, but.
We got 5 hours in the tent, that we could probably, Robert and I could probably come up with, but we have other things we got to attend to. So, but I really appreciate
We'll get you back for the other 4 hours.
Okay, fair enough.
Thank you guys so much.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Roberto.
John, Sailor.
You bet, guys.
We have David Genovese from the Corbin Project in Darien, and David Waldman, who has been the biggest redeveloper of Westport. So I hope you'll join us next Thursday at 4 o'clock. Thanks, everybody. Bye.